Hello and welcome to the Attention Shift podcast. I'm Ed Abbis, and today I've got a very special guest with me. Ben, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi Ed, firstly thanks for having me on the show. My name's Ben Wells. I run a strategy and technology consultancy called PTI, which some of your listeners may have come across before. We work exclusively in the sports and entertainment space. We work with a number of clients across different sports: football, rugby, cricket, racing, and in the entertainment space. And we pride ourselves on being the only genuinely vendor agnostic advisory in this space in the UK and Ireland. So, delighted to be on the show, and really looking forward to discussing some of the things that we've been talking about off camera.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Yeah, we caught up recently a few weeks ago, and we got chatting about a report that we just done around the Anonymous Fan Index, but then obviously we chatted about the Sports Leadership Benchmark report, if I can get my words out, the second edition of that you've recently produced as well. So could you give us a bit of information, sort of set the scene really what that is, and ultimately what you are, I guess the learnings that you're giving to the industry from it?
Yeah, so we decided to launch the Sports Leadership Benchmark in 2024 because we can see a lot of challenges in the industry, and challenges and opportunities in the industry due to a lack of sophistication around data and technology. And it's always very difficult when you're creating these kind of reports, and it sort of sits in line with a lot of the content that we produce, which may look to be critical, but actually is coming from a place of love, in that things could be so much better. I mean, Ed, we were talking about this before. You and I have both worked rights holder side. We know the realities of why certain things are not prioritised in terms of understanding or action. But what we wanted to try and do is to put some data points against what was our experience of working in this industry. And apart from anything else, some of the information is comes out. I think a lot of people react and go, "Oh God, this is quite scary." How behind we are. But equally, a lot of the time when we've audited clients, the first reaction is like, "How bad are we?" And you can actually then say, "Well, look, it's not great, but as you can see, it's not like you're down here and everyone else is miles ahead, because everyone is sort of hanging around the mid to bottom half of the scale in terms of sophistication." But we see that as an opportunity, and I think particularly when some things we're talking around the changing dynamics around revenue models in sport and changing profiles around risk. I think this creates a great opportunity for those, and what we were very keen to do was to try and split our findings out between different tiers. So we've categorised rights holders based on assumed turnover. So tier 1 is 100 mil plus turnover. As you can imagine, there's not many of those. We calculated about 12.5%. Tier 2 is 10 to 100 million, and then tier 3 is below 10. But the majority of the work that we do, the majority of our focus is on tiers 2 and 3. And those are the organisations we've referred to over the last 3 or 4 years as the squeeze middle. Organisations for whom cost bases remain high, whether that's just the cost of operating the business or athlete costs or whatever that may be. But there is an ambition at the other end to try and strive to do bigger things, for which they need more revenue. And actually they're getting hit on both sides, because the revenue generation is harder than it's ever been, I think, in the certainly 30 years I've been in this industry. I know I don't look old enough. Cost bases are growing massively. Whatever the inflationary figures are of the day, operational costs are increasing, and athlete costs, particularly in sports like football, are showing no signs of abating. So something has to give, and we're trying to provide some stark data points to help people realise that, wow, we need to start thinking about this whole space differently. And without this turning into a gigantic monologue, it's 30 years since Amazon launched. It's not like digital technology and data are new things. These are now part of our daily lives, and our kids are growing up knowing no other way of operating. and yet you look at many sports organisations, and it feels like they're still stuck very much in an analog model, with some of these things sort of bolted on the side, almost as like nice to haves. And the context for this is the world's moving quickly around us, and particularly other digital led platforms and activities which are being adopted by people because they're easy to buy from. You can do them on the move. We're in a race with these guys for share of time and wallet, and frankly, most people are going to lose unless they transform.
Yeah, I was reading through your report as well, and just to give a sense of obviously the scale of tier 2 and tier 3s, it's close to 90% of sports organisations sit in that tier 2, tier 3. So it's not like we're talking about a very small minority. Yes, on a monetary basis, the big ones are big, but ultimately all these sports exist for lots of lovers of those sports, and they're 100%. All in that tier that ultimately are not
100%
having the impact they would like to have. And I think, like you said there, when you give that context of 30 years of Amazon, it just goes to show that whilst it feels like innovation is fast, it actually, these things don't always happen that fast. Even though everyone's getting caught up now in the world of AI and everything that's going on with it, things still do move relatively slowly. So it's never too late. I think, as the saying goes, like if you address the problem, you can fix the problem. And for us, look, there was a strange coincidence, right? When we spoke a few weeks ago, where we said we'd both done these reports, and there was lots of similarities that we found, even though we'd come at it in a slightly different way. And I think we were both saying that we were seeing sports organisations are ultimately need to take alternative routes to bring cash into their businesses. That tech infrastructure and hires need to be a bigger priority than perhaps backfilling as has gone on. And we've seen a few organisations that have done that. We had Joe Dakins on from Burnley Football Club recently as well, that was talking about his role as CTO within the club, and it's the first time they'd had one. And I think particularly for tier 2 and tier 3 sports organisations, the metrics that are impacting the value of sponsorships are shifting more towards engagement and community-led data
100%.
Points, though they're not necessarily keeping pace with that. No. How did you find that within your findings?
Well, the context for the way we look at this is we can come out with the stats around the lack of integrated data strategies or whatever else, but it's very easy to sort of shrug your shoulders and say, well, so what does that mean? And the way that we see it, I think, looking at if you look at the revenue streams coming into sport, the traditional sports model, the media industry is a challenge. Let's be honest. There are fewer and fewer premium rights for which broadcasters are prepared to pay, and the risk is that a lot of the rest of the content just becomes filler content. It's filling up the schedules until the main event of whatever that may be, and so people are getting less and less. And being very honest with you, I think sport's been pretty slow to understand that dynamic is changing, and we need to create a better value proposition for the broadcaster and for the viewer. Some have been good, others not so good. And some, if you look at the PSA, Professional Squash Association, they recognised this a long time ago and went direct to customer, and they've done a fantastic job, and they should be applauded for that. But most people are sat around sort of thinking the next check's going to come and it's going to be an increase because everything always goes up. I mean, the reality is on a per game basis, even the Premier League has been going backwards domestically since 2016-19. So we're seeing now a lot of rights holders are selling off more and more inventory just to keep the gross number higher because it sounds good. But the reality is that there is so much content now that on a unit basis we're actually devaluing what we're selling. So media is a challenge. Sponsorship, again, outside of the very, very elite, is a challenge. Most propositions are undifferentiated. They are just variations on the same theme, and rights holders by and large haven't invested too much in creating a story around why they are different, and that for me is all around their brand proposition and around their customer base. And when you look at the fact that 72% now of global advertising spend, which obviously includes sponsorship, goes into digital platforms, That means that 28% of global spend now is being shared between what was traditionally, the marketing mix that you and I grew up with, out of home,
Yeah.
print, TV, radio, and all that kind of stuff. And the reality, I think, is that, and I think this goes back to 2008, there's been a lack of liquidity in the economy since then, since the financial crisis. And at the same time, we've had the growth of social media platforms. And what we've done is we just outsourced our engagement strategy to those platforms because it's easy, it's ready made. But these guys haven't shared any data, they haven't shared any revenue, and from a brand perspective, the marketeers are there. And I've said this before: when was the last great integrated brand campaign that you ever saw? I can't remember.
Yeah.
Where you'd be hit by something on the way to work, during work, on the way home. These things just don't happen now because all this money is going to paid search and paid social. And I'm sure there are tons of brand marketeers out there saying we want to use sport or music or whatever, things people care about, to engage with the human side of things, which is obviously what they're trying to do. But they've got to keep the CFO happy because he'll say, well, look, I get all that. That sounds great, but I can get 1.5 times return by putting the money into paid search, and we've got the flexibility. So all that kind of stuff, I think, has impacted, and we haven't done the work. For us, as we said in our report, the battle for brands for brand spend is on who has the best data. And I believe fundamentally that if you can ally all the great things about sport in terms of its ability to connect with people, the ability to build communities around it with world-class data, you have a much, much better proposition for brands than who has the best algorithm, which is sterile and boring and undifferentiated. But we haven't done the work, and the data in our report and in yours shows that is the case.
I can't remember who said it to me once, but they said the businesses of the future will be judged on how much data they hold and not what their turnover is. Now, look, turnover is important, right? But that race to actually own that data and have a depth of data is...
the data will drive the turnover. Ultimately.
Absolutely.
For years,
I think that's the point. That's the point they were trying to get at, right? When they said it, and I cannot remember who said it to me.
I mean, people for years said, why is Amazon's share price so high when they've not actually turned over a profit? And the reality is that those losses were incurred in building the tech that they needed to drive the future income, and their share price effectively was predicated on being 5 or 6 years in the future. And once they amortize that investment in their technology, they're driving very, very high margin revenue. And we show a chart in many of our decks which shows the markup of the top 10 companies globally, 2004 and 2024. And 2004, it's a mixture of FMCG, FS, energy, pharmaceutical, all kind of mix that you'd have expected 20 years ago. And 2024, 7 of the top 10 are tech companies because they've all basically invested into becoming data-led and digital first. And the markup of the companies in 2024 is 2.5 times that on average of those 20 years beforehand. So,
yeah,
but often I sometimes feel like I'm talking through these things and people feel like this doesn't really apply to us. We're a sports organisation. Well, of course you are. Of course this applies to you. Because you've got this ability to generate data in quantities and at a cost that other sectors would kill for, but unless they're buying tickets or shirts, they're just sitting as a hosting cost on the database. And as our report shows, I think 50% of our respondents are commercializing 10% or less of their database. So when we're thinking about how do we use this data to diversify our sponsorship proposition, how do we use it to generate a new business product development line or business diversification, that kind of thinking just isn't generally going on, because it's how do we use this data to try and sell those few seats that we can't sell on a Saturday. And this for me is the critical thing. It's not a technology thing. It's more thinking around, as a sports organisation, are we a 30-day-a-year event business? Or are we a 365-day-a-year media business? And yes, those match days are big days. That's where we're in the public eye. We get a disproportionate amount of our income. But why are we generating zero on the remaining 335? If we can start creating... Well, I remember having this conversation with a Premier League club that we were doing some work with, and we were looking at their ticketing data. And we started looking then at the people they weren't commercializing. And I sort of said to them, if you could commercialize, if you could take £1 a month off everyone in here who you're not currently generating income from, you could actually defray your ticket costs, which were a big bugbear of their match day supporters, and get a massive win with us. There's a significant amount. It was something like 15 quid a ticket or something that they could put down. And I knew, as I was talking to my client, I knew exactly. He said, well, actually, why can't I take £1 from these guys and keep ticket prices high?
Yeah.
But but that's the short-termism of, and particularly in football with PSR. And I get it. I'm not being critical. I understand it. But we've got to wean ourselves off this short-term thinking, because everything else is moving around us a lot quicker, and we're just basically trying to eke another 2 or 3% out of what for me is a dying model.
Yeah, so a few things from me on the back of that as well. So like we'd seen the similar kind of thing in our report as well, where I think over half said that they believed they were going to lose at least $100,000 a year by not reaching fans directly. Which, I mean, and the rest, right? I mean, it's going to be a way bigger figure than that. But 33% estimated those losses could be anywhere between 1 and 5 million. I'm using dollars a year because we have people from different parts of the world doing this, and I think it backs up your point. And I think just coming back to what you said there, this idea of being always on outside of those event days per year. Look, some are starting to do it now, whether they're thinking about doing, concerts at their stadiums, things like that. But I've often thought about this from a content perspective as well. You see creators popping up across multiple sports now who are creating content multiple times a day to large audiences, saying it how it is, speaking to the fans. I mean, often I say that they're eating the lunch, the breakfast and the dinner of the actual rights holder.
Yeah, of course.
They're doing like, and I think a lot of these rights holders, if I think about football clubs, tried to do TV channels back in the day, got burnt by the huge costs that came with it, and have never then gone back to the idea that now with the infrastructure that exists, they could be creating content on some of these channels that they don't own, but working out how they create that content so it converts back to their own wants and needs and channels. Because often you'll find when you go into these organisations that the production team sits separate from the social team, and the social team sits separate from the digital team, and they sit separate from the commercial team. And I've been into plenty of these organisations where I'll sit in a room and I'll bring everyone together, and these people barely know each other, and you feel like you're introducing them.
Yes, we see that an awful lot, and the organisations tend to be siloed, and we see that as being a big challenge from a technology perspective, because and a data perspective, because we see it with multiple organisations where these guys are collecting this kind of data and those guys are collecting that, and there's no unique identifier. And we had this again. This was a Premier League club that we audited, where they had a guy, I think internally, who they had 7.5 million individual pieces of data, which they tried to piece together. As I think I said to you when we were sort of talking about previously, like the Naked Gun movies, where they're sort of trying to look for an arm with a tattoo, and that's created a whole person here. But that's because no one had defined what data was useful to the business and why that was. So when we talk about the lack of integrated data strategies in business, this is what we're talking about. And because that doesn't exist for the most part, this isn't me just saying it, the data in our report backs it up. You've got people doing what they think is right, and it becomes massively inefficient. I mean, before you even get into sort of data protection and all that kind of stuff, is because there is an absence of direction as to what we need to collect and how we're going to use it. Everyone just collects everything, and so you end up with these enormous hosting costs. We had it with one client. They were sitting on 700,000 data records, and 200,000 of them were opted-in records. But they kept the 700,000 because it sounded good to sponsors. And we said,
absolutely.
With all due respect, most brands have moved beyond, how many have you got? They want to know who's engaged, what do you know about them, where do these guys go on holiday, what car do they drive, etc., because that's how they're going to commercialise that data. And we said the reality here is you've got an extra 500,000 records which are you're paying to host, and by the way, if you get breached by whichever bad actor is trying this week, you've got 2.5 times your exposure, or 3.5 times your exposure. Excuse my maths, with no commercial upside. So we told them to repermission them and then delete those that didn't come back in. And they went from 200 to 300,000 records. So what they'd effectively done was improve their buying audience by 50% overnight at virtually no cost and de-risk the business. But because people hadn't understood, within this hadn't understood how all this worked, they just thought, well, more is better, isn't it? More's got to be better, because more is always better. And actually, it's around the quality of data rather than the quantity. But unless you're actually laser focused on how you're going to use that data, you end up with that massively inefficient, and when I say inefficient, I mean expensive expensive data that you've got no commercial upside for. And going back to the silos, you see in the dynamic as well, where you might have the marketing guy spending, I don't know, 10 quid a record to bring new data in on one side, and on the other hand you've got the sponsorship guy selling a deal for however many £1,000 to a industrial boiler company, and part of that is he gets 4 emails a year to the database who quite honestly don't care about industrial boilers, and it's the number one cause of churn. And so you've got the marketing guy then going, well, hang on a second, this boss is going, how come our database is getting smaller despite all this money I'm giving you? Well, sponsorship guy over here is killing us because he's doing all these terrible deals, but he's getting his bonus because he's being incentivized on gross revenue rather than net position on these things, and these things just clash. And if data was genuinely important to the business, the CEO going, hang on a second, that 50 grand or whatever we've got for this crap boiler deal, we're not doing that deal, because actually protecting our data, protecting capital value in our business is what's the priority.
So it
because
feels
we know what the back to your point, if this guy unsubscribes and he spends £10,000 with us a year, that's an extreme example, it's going to take 5 years for that one person to cover the cost of this boiler deal, effectively. So, but left hand, right hand, they don't talk, and it comes back to sports organisations being primarily short term sales led businesses when they actually need to be longer term marketing led. And that is changing slowly, but not quickly enough, in my view.
But it does feel like it's a well, I'm not going to use the word problem, a challenge of leadership, right? That ultimately, I think the identikit of people in general that probably sat at the top of some of these organisations, certainly from my time, often were financial led or law degree led, rather than necessarily marketing, business growth led. And it's not like I'm saying they should all be marketeers suddenly running all of these businesses, because I'm a marketeer by long time ago training. But ultimately that idea of how do we bring all these things together, because the reality is that's what these businesses have become, right? And again, you know this like I do, there's a disproportionate amount of investment that goes into the playing side, right, for obvious reasons, because that's where all the money goes out of the business. But on one hand, there'll be 50 million being spent on this player at the same time.
Yes.
They're beg, stealing and borrowing to try and do some of the things that you talked about.
Yeah, exactly. And we in our report we ask what what the obstacles are towards to addressing some of the things that we identify. And look, the usual things come up: lack of time, lack of budget, lack of resource, lack of expertise. And for me, look, I think in a lot of organisations, the reality is it's a lack of prioritisation, because I'm not sure everyone has realised just how different the world is. So we identify a number of trends in our first report, which these were going on pre-COVID, but the pandemic changed so many things in terms of the way that people behave and what they see as being valuable, that it's accelerated them. So we've obviously had financial pressure since 2008, and those were exacerbated by COVID. And whereas many agencies in our place were sort of going like the 1920s, post Spanish flu, everything's going to be brilliant, we were saying, hang on a second, there is a long tail here of the economic fallout, and we have to be prepared to cut our cloth accordingly. And I'm not sure everyone has. So you've got economic, You've got the ongoing technological revolution, which, AI was being talked about, pre-COVID, but it's become so ubiquitous since. And look, we think there are big opportunities for AI within our industry, but not until foundational technologies and processes have been put in place. So you've got economic, you've got technological, you've got behavioural. So even adults, we changed huge amounts, so many different ways post pandemic. How many times do you go to the pub these days? People realise it's just so expensive, and people drink at home. But markedly, you've got technological. You've got generational rather. So I look at how my son consumes. He's football mad like me, but he consumes football in a totally different way. But yet we are still packaging things up by and large for that. That pre-COVID, almost.
And I think
previous generation, the way they did it.
And from a rights holder perspective, you often see this as well, that focus tends to be for the big bang around that sort of event itself. And the reality is I always think about the live event itself as a live moment. This actually is more like a window of 72 hours, and where you're going from blocks of 72 hours to blocks of 72 hours. And actually you could maximise that way more, which is something that you do see these independent creators doing a much better job of doing than perhaps you see those rights holders doing themselves.
Yeah, and look, they've got the benefit of being agile and not having to go through multiple internal committees and the baggage of this is how we've always done it, and we don't want to do that because we might upset so and so. So they have got those those benefits and those advantages, but I do think that we should be able to behave in a much better way. And I mean, it's interesting, we see this at the moment as well, that the number of clients that we work with whose data is managed by a third party agency, and they can't access their data in real time. It takes days, it costs them more money, and by that time the moment has gone. And the reality is, again, back to my point, is if internally the role of data had been prioritized in terms of this is a key driver for us, both in terms of driving efficiencies and driving revenue growth, then the cost of bringing that in-house and probably hiring a couple of analysts far is outweighed by the commercial upside. But because it's just cheaper and easier to outsource it to an agency who probably isn't adding a huge amount of value, it's just easy, isn't it? But we're missing out because we haven't, great data's done, we've got this agency and they're doing all this stuff for us, brilliant data, tick, what's next? And actually that's really, you're scratching the surface with it because you haven't understood it. And so again, as I say, when I hear people talk to you about AI, and I go, guys, with all due respect, you're working off spreadsheets. So what do you think AI is going to do for your business? Because you need good data, structured data, and good technology for the AI engine to sit on top of, to capitalize upon it. It's not going to work off the disjointed spreadsheets that you've got dotted all over your business. But I get it. Everyone's time short. We're all looking for a silver bullet, but it completely misunderstands how any of this stuff works. And back to our report shows the lack of senior technology expertise within these organizations. 15% don't have any technology representation at all. And I think from memory, 57% didn't have a director level or above technology lead. So guess what? You're not going to get particularly great advice from people internally. With all the best will in the world, we see it where you've got people who are, and their technology lead is the guy that basically fixes your laptop, and then you're asking him to write a Wi-Fi strategy. I'm not exaggerating. That was a conversation I had last week.
No, I know. I've heard it as well. Yeah.
So the reality is these things, you pay peanuts, you get monkeys, and there's lots of guys doing great jobs in that space, but it's just not their area of expertise, and it's unfair to expect them to be, solving what should be front and center of your business strategy in 2026. As I say, 32 years since Amazon launched, and we're still having these conversations about, I don't really think this is an area of priority for us, and I can't really understand it. I can't believe it. And it's not so long ago I had CEO of a Premier League club told me he didn't understand digital because he wasn't on Facebook, and I thought I just don't even know where to start.
Everyone's moved on.
Where to start with that.
It is. It's interesting, right? And I was going to sort of say this to you, and you, when you were talking about, then you were talking about having the right people in place, and it's not a fault of the people, right? They're part of a structure that's been created way above them. But I know for a fact that one of the major UK Olympic sports governing bodies, one of the people that works with the business, who's very capable, that role is head of IT and digital. It's kind of like, it's not like, how are you head of IT and digital? But ultimately, and that's because that person has an interest in both, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that it fits the structure that you need in that organisation.
No, and look, the thing is, I say, that CEO that I referenced, smart guy, really, really smart guy, but this isn't an area that he's expert in. But it's the lack of curiosity and going, hang on a second, I need to get someone in that really understands this, going to help guide me on that journey. But for whatever reasons, I say, maybe it's people don't have the time, or there are just so many fires that people are putting out, and particularly looking in the NGB space, the national governing body space, the amount of time that CEOs have to spend on governance, it's, they're being asked to do their jobs, a lot of them, with not just one, but sometimes two hands tied behind their back. It's exceptionally difficult for them. And as I say, we're not sitting here taking pot shots. We understand the reasons behind it. The argument is for us is that this stuff just needs to go up the priority list, up to the agenda of the way that people are thinking about it. So we're always asked, who's doing this well, and this sounds such a lazy response, but the answer is not many people. I mentioned PSA earlier on, and I really like what they're doing there, and they've approached this with a dose of reality, and I think they're thriving off the back of understanding the world had changed. They needed to change their model.
And just to add to that as well, because obviously I do know them very well, and obviously like we worked with them for a couple of years now, but I've worked with them in a former life as well when they did this back in my Perform days. So 15 years ago, they went down this path of we are going to do as much as we can in-house and be masters of our own destiny, and giving themselves the framework, the infrastructure to be able to build on that. And that's hard, right? And Alex and Lee, who run that day to day, who both ex-players themselves, right? So not necessarily coming from a background that you would say is obvious to then go in and run a global sports federation, and the challenges that they went through with ownership as well. They have come out the other side of it, and they potentially are set up to be able to scale moving forward in a way that there's not many. I mean, look, I know the commercial rights part of the federation, but ultimately they function like they're the federation. There's not many set up to do that.
No, and look, it is difficult. I mean, we did a lot of work 2 or 3 years ago with British Cycling, which is another organisation that I think has been led very, very well in recent years. And we sat down with those guys, and their need for digital transformation came from a very real point of looking at long-term cash flow and the future of the business to say what we are doing it's not working. Okay, and at some point we're going to run out of money, and but you need a leader who's got the vision to see that, the ability to say, look, I know we need to go down this route, but I don't know very much about it. I need to get people in that understand this, going to help translate business strategy into technology design and deployment, which is sort of what we do, and then have the strength to see that program through. And finding leaders who've got all those qualities and are able to ride out excuse the pun, ride out the sort of the slings and arrows of what goes on. It's a very difficult gig, and as I say, we're not being critical. We recognise that there are challenges there, but I think this needs to go up the agenda, and I think it's not always easy for a CEO to say, I just don't understand this space. I need help. I think there's a real pressure, particularly in sports like football, for the CEO to be omnipotent and all knowing, and it's just the reality. That's no one is, and so you build a team of good people around it. But unless you're actually going to start saying, look, data and technology are basically going to be front and center of how we are going to grow this business. This isn't a fad. Like I think some people thought it was 10 years ago. This is the biggest disruption to industry since the spinning jenny. And I know, coming from where you do, there's a cultural resonation there. But this is enormous, and for many organisations, as I say, I think rather than saying like we need to now build our business around this new way of working, around digital technology, around the ability to move quickly and be everywhere, but provide personalised experiences, think about lifetime value, all that kind of stuff. Most organisations, that sounds like too much work and we've got too much on. Let's carry on doing what we're doing, which is selling what we want rather than what people want to buy. 30 days a year, and we'll just rinse that as hard as we can. And look, we'll do a bit of that data stuff. We'll use data to sell tickets and data to sell shirts, and meanwhile, people are going, well, this is lip service. It's and this is the crazy thing. Like we talk a lot about engagement in our industry, and it's become a buzzword. And I'm pretty sure if you ask most CEOs, is engagement important? Oh yeah, engagement's really important.
I've got a fan engagement strategy. I'm buttoned up. That's fine. Cool.
Exactly. And you say, but why is it important? And they can't really explain it. They can't really quantify it. And
it always concerns. Yeah, I was going to say sorry. It always concerns me whenever I see a sports organisation come out and publish their fan engagement strategy.
Yeah,
because ultimately you are literally built to engage fans. Why do you need a separate strategy to be able to do it? Well, that's your whole existence should be about engaging fans. Like you shouldn't need a separate strategy.
Of course, it's all part of the business plan, the marketing strategy. But it's for us, the engagement is around providing a value proposition in return for data, so we can learn. We can capture new people, but also we can learn more about existing customers, and we use that data to improve the experience. And if we improve the experience, they stay loyal, they spend more, they advocate. And by the way, we can package all that up now, and in the right way, we can now start integrating sponsors into that experience. And that's the way that we think it should be working. But as far as I can tell, and the data again in our report maps, bears this out, because 20%, I think, on both metrics are measuring cost per acquisition and then measuring customer lifetime value. So the reality is that 80% of people are basically engaging with no idea about what they're doing. Does it work? We don't know. Does it work for this segment? Or we haven't got a clue. But they're just busy being busy, and they're busy spending money with no upside. And again, it all comes back to this, sport mindset. We've just got to do stuff. We've got to work at 100 miles an hour. Everyone's so flat out. And we say this many, many times when we audit clients, like, you've got way too many people in your organization because you haven't ever taken any time to understand how you can use technology to automate your business, to build integrations between systems. They backfill them with people. And we ask this a lot, what's the single biggest thing that would improve your life working here? More people. All you would do is bring more people in and make them inefficient. So you're increasing your headcount costs and not necessarily improving your revenues. But no one stops us. Hang on a second. Let's just take a couple of steps back and look at this and go, wow, we've actually got this bloated organisation here, which is, I'm not questioning for 1 second people's work ethic or their commitment. But they're not given the structure, the framework, or the tools to work in an effective and efficient way. And if you could harness that, your business would either be a lot more productive, or you could actually save some costs here on headcount. And businesses they can choose which is the right path. But it's extraordinary in these straitened times how flabby so many of these organisations are, because they're not giving themselves the time to think about it.
So as we come to the end of this discussion, and we could literally do this for hours, right? Let's try and think about...
We have, haven't we?
We have, we have. Let's think about some practical ways that ultimately... No, probably not. No, we'll have a look at the metrics later. We can see where the drop-off was.
When I started talking, yeah.
So it feels like there needs to be some changes at board level in terms of how these things are, at the very least, measured so people can start to quantify. So, for instance... it feels like at the very least they need to be tracking the percentage of fans they can actually identify and understand. Because coming back to your point earlier, where you said that 700,000, and actually it was only 200,000 that were physically GDPR compliant and things like that. Like ultimately, if that started to be a metric that was tracked at board level along with turnover and attendance and rights revenue, then it'd have to be taken more seriously, right? Surely that's going to help.
Yeah, I think so, and I think again, there's often in organisations there's a massive disconnect at every level. But and look, people measure what they can measure because it's easy. So we end up seeing all manner of reports where, oh, look, our Instagram followers are up, or our number of likes on Facebook is up, and you're like, well, so what? I mean, it's great they're up. I don't know how many of those are bots. Do you count that? No, probably not. But the big question ultimately is for us. In all this space, if as a business, you're doing things either to save money or to make money, and that's how you create a sustainable business. So everything has to flow backwards from that. So you then need to start building your KPI framework around those two North Stars, and then you drill down into that. And as Einstein said, not everything that counts can be counted, not everything that be counted counts. So you have to try and find a way to measure that. But we had one client recently because their strategy was a bit fuzzy. They had a KPI dashboard, about 200 metrics on it. So guess what? Everyone in the business thought everything was a priority. And so, you can actually identify the 2 or 3 levers that you needed to pull. And, we've done this for clients where we built KPI frameworks, working backwards from their business plan, looking at, B2B and B2C revenues. And the B2C revenues ultimately is a function of how many people you've got in your database and the spend per head. Obviously, those are segmented, quite granular levels. But you've got to understand how you are going to grow those segments and how you're going to generate more money from those segments if you want to try and hit. And it becomes really quite mechanical. But it's also, when you break it down like that, it becomes really quite clear. And okay, at the beneath that, you might have some engagement stats and stuff on social media, which becomes interesting. It's anecdotal, and you might be able to tie a correlation between Facebook likes going up and a particular segment increasing in size or revenue, whatever. Of course, that's interesting. But as a business, you need to be really, really clear about what the key drivers are, for change. And I think the big challenge is, in recent years, too many haven't realised the dynamic has changed, both in terms of those traditional revenue streams and the fact that they're all under pressure, but also I think the risk profile has changed. I think this has been changing since 2008. I look back, say, to the World Cup 1998, when football was probably at its apogee in terms of everyone wanted to do stuff, and you'd see adverts around the World Cup, and every different product was using football to sell it. As we get now to 2026, the number of people that can afford to buy in at the top level is tiny, because the top guys charge so much. And then there's an enormous drop off after that threshold finishes. But the guys at the bottom, with all due respect, I can afford to sponsor you, but you're not going to drive very much for me. So the guys below that, I've got to say, okay, I get it. We're not going to sell in the same way as the big guys. We need to start selling on the uniqueness of our proposition. We need to start understanding how we're different, what story we're trying to tell. Know all about our customers, and by the way, not just know all about them, but because we know all about them, we're giving them a great time. They are super engaged with what we're doing. They're big advocates for us, and brands go, do you know what, I like that. I can afford to buy in, but actually, this is a good platform for us. And I think what you then end up with is committed partners who are trying to grow the size of that audience for mutual benefit. That whole, we sell rights and you buy rights, and you have budget and we want your budget, that transactional thing, I think, is dead for 90% of rights holders. Anyone below tier 1 should be looking at how do we work together almost in a cashless way to drive benefit from building a much bigger, more engaged audience. So we're talking about genuine partnerships. Sorry. I mean, 20 years ago we all said, sponsorship department sounds quite transactional and not very friendly. So everyone rebranded to be partnerships, and they carried on doing what they were doing, which was selling stuff. Whereas I'm talking here about genuine partnerships where A plus B equals more than the sum of A plus B.
And there's a reality as well that when you do get away from the tier ones now to tier twos and tier threes, that the professional sportsmen and women that are part of it are accessible. You can do things with them. They actually want to be activated, do things like ultimately meet the fans. I think that thing that used to exist in football a long time ago, that's not there anymore now because it's become so big and so vast, I think can still go on. And like I said, I've attended some of the smaller sports, and I think that's a massive opportunity for them to ultimately be able to do that activation.
Yeah, look, again, it's people realising that what they're doing isn't working, that all their numbers are probably going backwards, the world is spinning faster around us, and if we want to remain relevant, we have to adapt. And that's not a case of copying others, it's a case of understanding what makes you unique, and being proud of that. And okay, you might not have the massive numbers that a Man United have got or whomever, but that's fine. There's no problem. Don't try and compete with Man United. You're going to die ultimately. Be proud of what you've got. And yeah. As I said before, it's a fantastic book. Small Data. For years people have been sort of trying to scare organisations about the need to have big data. Well, you need big data if you are, if you are Google or whomever. But it's all about the small data. It's about quality over quantity. But to know what's important, you've got to work backwards from data strategy and how data strategy supports your wider business goals, and that will then create the framework for what is it we are trying to collect here. And actually, are we happy spending this to acquire this data? Well, we are, because we can see what comes out the other side. And great, the more I invest here, the more comes out the other side. It becomes a self-generating revenue model. But yeah, it sounds a lot easier than it is. It takes time. It's going to cost money. But for me, it's the only way in 2026 that sports organisations in Tier 2 and Tier 3 are going to be able to compete.
Ben, this has been fascinating. Really, really enjoyed it. So what we will do is, for anyone who's watching or listening to this, on the Display website where the podcast sits, there'll be a summary of what we've discussed today. There'll be links to Ben's report and also to our report as well from Display. I'm sure Ben will happily get back to anyone on LinkedIn who wants to know more about what he's been discussing today. But just from my perspective, look, I found this really, really interesting, really insightful. So thank you so much.
Likewise. Thank you.
For giving an hour. No, my pleasure.
It's been great. The time has flown. The listeners may disagree, but I've enjoyed it.
As always, if you've enjoyed this episode of The Attention Shift, drop a link, smash the subscribe button, share it to anyone you know. I'm sure Ben would love the ability to get this show far and wide so more people can hear about his report. If you'd like to contact me on LinkedIn, you can DM me, also Joe Redfern as well, Ben himself, or you can email the show at hello@attentionshift.media. Thanks again, and catch you next time.